That's the model. We're going to compute these amplitudes, frequencies, and phases in an iterative fashion using successive approximation. Now, the advantage of this, well, let me give you a disadvantage. A disadvantage is that the analysis, because it's iterative, is somewhat slow compared to just picking the peaks of the Fourier transform. But the synthesis can be done using the fast Fourier transform. So the synthesis is very, very fast. And usually the synthesis is the more important of the two, the analysis versus synthesis. So that makes it very attractive. And then the other thing that's nice about this particular model is it gives us flexibility to do modifications. So we can change the time scale, we can change the pitch, we can change spectral characteristics and things like that. So let us look graphically at how this approach would work and why it might be attractive. Imagine that you have a Fourier transform of a segment of speech. So like I showed you before, this is what you get. These peaks here, the separation of those peaks represent the pitch period, and you can kind of see the forming frequencies, right? Those cluster of samples that corresponds to the resonance frequencies. The first thing that we do is we compute this Fourier transform. We identify the sinusoid that's most dominant. We look at its amplitude, frequency, and phase, and then we subtract it from the signal. So now we have our first sinusoid, amplitude, frequency, and phase, and then we have the residual, everything else that's left. And then after we subtract that off, we look at the next dominant sinusoid, and then we subtract that off. And you know what we do after that? Look for the next dominant sinusoid, amplitude, frequency, phase, and subtract. And we keep doing that. Now, what is the advantage of doing that versus just picking the peaks? There's a windowing effect. Each one of these sinusoids, because it's windowed, it's not infinite, has side lobes associated with it. And so we subtract off those side lobes in this process. If you just pick the peaks, you have the interference of all the side lobes. So the argument is that you get a more accurate representation, a sinusoidal representation, by doing it sequentially than if you were just to use the original approach of identifying the peaks. So it leads to higher quality. That's the approach. Okay. So we're comfortable with the way the algorithm works. Successive approximation. We get a set of amplitudes, frequencies, and phases. Now, to help us with greater flexibility, what we do is we introduce a little bit of a structure into this representation, and we formulate it this way. We say that on a frame-by-frame basis, our synthesis is going to be represented as a sum of amplitudes of these cosines, these sinusoids, where we have a fundamental frequency, right, that's spacing, plus, and we allow for an offset, so we can have flexibility here, plus a phase. So actually we have 4 parameters here in that representation. Turns out we can make this 0 and still achieve very, very high quality representation. So that's the structure here. In the beginning, it was analysis by synthesis to compute these different parameters, the amplitudes and frequencies. We have a minus space. All right? So let's look and see how we make this work. So here's an illustration, right? We start out and we window a segment and perform the analysis. So here's our windowed segment, for example. What do? We compute the Fourier transform of that, and then we do that successive approximation. And for each windowed segment, we get a set of amplitudes, frequencies, and phases according to the formula that I just showed you. All lines clear? So now, on a window basis, if we want to reconstruct using the overlap and add approach, we can take the windowed segment, we can then generate the sinusoids, reconstruct the signal, and then overlap and add them together again. So you see we've gone from the analysis, amplitudes and frequencies and phases for each of the segments, to resynthesize, we regenerate the signal, window it, and then add it back together again. So now we have an analysis synthesis. And the fun thing comes when you manipulate the amplitudes, frequencies, and phases in the middle. All right. So let us assume now that you wanted to scale the pitch. Why is this a good way of doing it, and how would you scale the pitch? Here's your equation that represents the signal. And so if I use this equation, right, I do my analysis, I get my amplitudes, frequencies, and phases. I showed you how you reconstruct. I can break it down, get the parameters, and reconstruct, and the two signals sound identical. Now I want to make a modification in the middle. In this case, I want to change the pitch. How would I do that? Well, here's the fundamental frequency. If I want to change the pitch, all I have to do is scale the fundamental frequency. And so that's real easy to do in this equation. It's trivial to do. So that's a nice parameter of this particular construct. Let's say I wanted to make the pitch time variable. So somebody says ah, and I want to make the person go ah, right? Any variation, how would I do that? That too is trivial. You just make the scaling factor time variable, and you can generate that nice effect. Let's say that you wanted to do a time scale, so make somebody speak faster or speak slower. Now, you have to be careful when you do this, because if you think that you can just take a segment, right, and compress it or expand it, that doesn't work. Because if you did that, you change the pitch. Right? You want to be able to time scale and keep everything the same. So how would you do that? We start out by windowing a segment. We have amplitudes, frequencies, and phases, and then generate the sinusoids within that window. We re-window and then synthesize. Well, if you wanted to do a time expansion, all you would have to do is to increase the size of the window. Run the sinusoids out, re-window it with a larger window, and then overlap and add. And now you have a natural way of expanding the time scale without changing anything else. So that's very convenient. So here's that same example illustrated, right? We can now expand the windows. And what if you wanted to make that same thing time-varying, time-scale modification? You would just use different expanded windows at different times, so that you could speed up this segment or expand the other segment. So that's the way the algorithm works. So let's hear some examples so we can understand and appreciate how this works. And we'll find out if I have the volume set correctly. Using the algorithm that I just talked about, here's an example of an original speech sentence with time-varying pitch scale modifications. First you'll hear the original, and then you'll hear the time-varying pitch scale modification.
Go and sit on the bed. Go and sit on the bed. Go and sit on the bed.
That hose can wash her feet. That hose can wash her feet.
All I did was vary the beta parameter in order to change the pitch. And of course, the quality is very now. Now let's consider time scale modification. So now I'm controlling the window in a time varying fashion.
Open the crate, but don't break the glass.
That's the original.
Open the crate, but don't break the glass.
Add the sum to the product of these three. Add sum to the product of these three.
So you can have some fun with that. So I can control time, I can control pitch. Great starting point. Now, one of the issues that I mentioned before was that the front-end analysis of this is much more involved from a computational complexity perspective. How much more so? So if you compare the quaternary Modulation method, which just takes the piece of the Fourier Transform, versus this successive approximation approach that I just talked about, when you look at the numbers, unfortunately, we're 11 times more complex. 11 times more computation has to be performed in doing it this way. Well, you can do your analysis offline, maybe that's not a big deal because the synthesis is very fast, but gee, wouldn't it be nice if you could speed that up in some way or another? And in fact, 60% of the total computation involves that exhaustive search process that we did. So, here's the approach that we've taken, all right? What we're going to do is to look for sets of sinusoids that we can subtract at one time. Instead of subtracting just one sinusoid, computing the residual, and then going to the next sinusoid, what if we took several sinusoids and subtracted them, chosen carefully so that they didn't interfere with each other? That's the strategy. So take a look at this, right? We go down the list and we look at the dominant sinusoids. As we go down the list, if the sinusoids are separated by some distance, we can compute the amount of side lobe interference that will be introduced there. And so if the separation is far enough, we can argue that the side lobe interference is negligible, and we can subtract the sinusoids off in sets without any negative impact on the quality. And that's exactly what we did. And so what you can compute based upon the window that you're using, you can look at the roll-off and you can set some threshold. We set 25 dB, all right? If the side lobes were down by 25 dB, we said the interference would be negligible. And so now we were able to choose all of the sinusoids there that had no interference. We treated them as a block and we subtracted them. Does that make sense to everybody? And of course, it's going to be signal dependent as to how many such sinusoids you have in a block. That's certainly things. So let's take a look at that. It turns out we have two broad classes of speech segments to consider. One would be voice sounds, and the other would be unvoiced sounds. So your voice sounds would be like vowel sounds like a, hello, right? That's a voice sound. Unvoiced sounds, you know, lots of noisy frequencies there. Those two classes of signals, all right, are going to have different structures with respect to how many non-interfering sinusoids you have. So it turns out, if you look at unvoiced sounds, you're not going to find many, that most of them are going to interfere. So your speed up there for unvoiced sounds is about 1.8. But for voice sounds, your speed up is 11.5. And because most of our speech involves voice sounds, overall, you end up getting a speed up of 5.2, a factor of 5.2, and that's significant. If you're doing singing, for example, that ratio is even more in our favor because we hold notes for a longer period of time. So the speed up almost comes close to the original, to the quaternary. So now the next question to ask perhaps is, what is the quality degradation? Let's analyze that. And so we did. So we did an experiment where we did subjective testing. And that's where you get people in a room and you ask them to listen to one set of signals or one set of test sentences, and you ask them to score the quality on a scale from 1 to 5, and you can do some ratings that way. So these are formal subjective tests, and what we did was we compared the overlap and add model, where we do this everything sequentially, with our multi-component implementation. And what we discovered, so here are the numbers. You see this plot? So this shows the same score for different timescale modifications. Now, the more you do a timescale modification, you will notice a degradation in quality. But here's the good news. You see this thing? There are actually two lines here. One is overlap and add. That's in light blue. And the multi-component model is in the darker blue. You can't even see where the other one is because they're so close. Here are the actual numbers that are being applied. Negligible degradation, but you get a tremendous speed advantage. 5.2. So that's the good news. So, want to mention, kind of in this track before I go on to applications, is the more you do parameter modification, the more challenges you have with quality. So when you do severe timescale modification, you do introduce some distortions. And so we looked at that. I'm going to show you an example of an original and a compressed. So here's what we did, just to illustrate that. We took one word called seat.
Seat.
All right? If I were now to take seat and compress it by a factor of 4, and then expand it again. Oh, actually, that's not this. This one's just the expansion.
C.
This is an expansion by a factor of 4. You hear there's some tonality, some distortion in that. That's pretty severe. What you can do is to look at the long-term statistics of the amplitudes. Just long-term statistics of the amplitude for each of the parameters and for each of the frames. And what you find out is that there's some variation in those amplitude parameters. That variation is not captured when you do a timescale modification. But what if you were to parameterize that variation very crudely? We use a simple sinusoidal characterization or model for each of these harmonics. Very crude. But what happens is it provides some additional richness into the signal, and it mitigates a lot of the tonality that you hear. Let's listen.
C.
Okay? Now here's using the long-term analysis.
C.
Okay? So a lot of that, in that extreme case, modeling those variations can help. All right.
Seat.
All right, let's go to the next one. So we're taking the sequence.
C.
Here we go. All right, first application. So what could you do with an algorithm like this? Well, it is a prime candidate for a music synthesizer, isn't it? Prime candidate, because synthesis is very fast, all FFT driven, and all the analysis is done offline. So with a music synthesizer, why, you're in heaven. So let me show you some very simple things that you might be able to use. Because you have the flexibility of arbitrary pitch manipulation and controlling the duration and so forth, and you can also control a lot of the characteristics associated with resonance frequencies, why you could take a small sampling of a musical instrument and then manipulate all the other things to produce sounds. Everybody got the idea? Very little storage, right? And you just control it. So let's look at some examples of this. First, I'm going to play the original for you of just a short little flute. This was a Chinese flute, I think, but a very short segment of the original. And then we take of that original, a very short segment of that original, and then we manipulate it. Okay? So here we go. So that's the original. And now we're going to take a short segment. And now we're going to manipulate it to form a tune. So the quality is very good, but what was missing was the transition. In the original, it was a transition that was there. So if you wanted to make it more natural, you could have a bank stored offline of transitions, and you just substituted the transitions, hardwired them in, with the variety that you would use. So here we take the first transition, and every time we use that, every time we have a transition. And this is what we do. And by varying the richness of the transitions, you can get a very, very good approximation to a wide variety of musical instruments. And again, because we're doing all of this from a very, very short segment of the instrument, the storage requirements are negligible. So that's our example. What I found most interesting, though, in my recollection, was the idea of applying this to singing, human singing. And so here's the vision that I have. There are a lot of people in this world many of whom are in my own family, who were not blessed with a golden voice. A golden singing voice, right? People who join a choir and are asked to resign. Wouldn't it be nice for these people to be able to take their voice, sing something, and have some background processing done to turn their voice into a nice voice, nice quality singing voice? Now, could I get funding from the National Science Foundation to do something like this? Probably not, even if you didn't even try. Okay? But it was a heck of a lot of fun to do this experiment. That's what I'm going to talk to you about now. How do we perform using these techniques, processing to enhance the quality of fluency? The first thing you need to do is you need to get a volunteer who doesn't have a good singing voice. I was not that person. I'm not that secure. Fortunately, my co-author, student who was working with me at that time, was not embarrassed at all. And so he volunteered for a lot of the demos that I'm going to show you. But what features do you want to have? First of all, you're going to want to be able to correct pitch, because people in that category probably need some help with pitch. You're also going to be able to want to control the time duration, holding that last note until the end. Not all of us can do that. Singing has another characteristic which is different from speech. It's called vibrato, and a lot of good singers have that kind of quality. And then you're also going to be able to want to be able to control the characteristics of the voice, to make the voice sound rich and things like this. So those are the parameters that we have to work with. Now, we could just take the algorithm as is and apply it to singing. What would happen if I do that? So let us consider timescale modification. So here's an example of a young woman, Kelly. She's going to be singing the first part of the Star Spangled Banner, or the last part of the Star Spangled Banner, which is one of the hardest pieces to sing, I think. But just a beautiful voice. And then I'm going to show you what happens when you try to timescale. Talk about timescale modification, you know the algorithm. Here's what happens when I directly apply that to Kelly's beautiful voice. Natural is not the word I will use to describe what it is that you just heard, okay? Clearly the duration was increased much longer, but there was a quality loss. What happened there, and why did we have that problem? If you were to look at the spectrogram, okay, frequency versus time, vibrato shows up as that oscillation in the frequencies. It is a low frequency oscillation, typically about 5 hertz, 5 to 8 hertz. When you do the timescale modification in the way that we describe, the vibrato frequency is also scaled, and you get that effect. So that's a problem that we have in the singing. So here's a solution. We use vibrato synchronous concatenation. What we do is we look at the vibrato signal. So this is that low varying signal, frequency of about 5 hertz. And we identify the boundaries. All right, so we look at kind of a full cycle there. And then we concatenate that. We replicate that as part of our timescale modification. And so that way we can preserve the pitch in a way, rather the quality in a way that's natural. So, let me now show you the timescale version of that. Remember the durations before. Here's what you get when you look at the timescale version. I can make her hold that note for as long as I want. Right? Forever. So we have something now that works. Okay. Now, one of the other features that you would like to have is to be able to control the quality, the richness of the signal. And for trained singers, they are able to do something with their articulators, their vocal tract, that gives them a boost here in the third form. It's called the singer's form. And so that we can handle simply by providing a boost, because we're operating in the frequency domain. We do our analysis by synthesis. So accordingly, we take a model singer, and we can boost these frequencies, which adds to the richness that you hear. So that's one thing that you can do, that we do. The other thing that we do is we try to separate the forms, okay? And we use a model to do that. So that when we do the spectral modification, we actually use a generalized weighted sum of Gaussians in order to identify the formants. And this allows us then to move formant frequencies over, to actually take the person's voice, but shift formant frequencies up or down. And so there's some rules of thumb that we can get from professional singers, how they have taken a high frequency formant and they kind of move it over and they shift it into that third formant. And so we can do that kind of formant manipulation in this way because we're operating in the frequency. And that adds to the richness of the signal. And then we can also control the vibrato. And that's a very easy thing to do because for each signal, we can use a modulation of the frequency, fundamental frequency. And to make it a little more natural, sometimes we ramp up the amplitude of that fundamental frequency. So these are the components that we can use to enhance the quality of the signal. And that was the approach that we take. So now I'd like to perhaps play a little example for you so you can see. This is Matt Lee. I forgot. All right, let's try this one. So that's Matt, a golden voice he does not have. Modification. Well, if we can do that, we say, gee, what if we try to sing a real song? We add a little music to it. Let's see what we can, So we said, what is one of the hardest songs in the world to sing? It was Christmas time. We said, what about Oh Holy Night? This is one where you try and sing that in all one voice. It sound terrible. Here's an example of sounding terrible. And so as you listen to this, be able to sling it under the table and say, when will the torture end? I'm with you. Okay, so enough of that. Let's yeah, okay. We add a little bit of music. We enhance the voice. In the original, it did not have a high notes at all, right? So we had to do a fair amount of work to do that. But the point is that the algorithm does provide the flexibility to do this kind of enhancement for singing. Again, not a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation, but was probably some of the most enjoyable work I've ever done. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Please don't be scared. Please do this in the wood.
Okay, question in the back. Yes, sir.
So now there are many places where voice recognition is being used as a biometric. So can this be used to cheat those systems?
Oh, so it depends on what you pull out, but we can reproduce the quality of someone's voice. Now, and yes, probably so. The easiest way to defeat those, though, is just to get a recording of the person's voice.
But would recording have all the pitches and notes and all the frequencies that would you have speaking directly to get into a system?
So a biometric, one biometric scenario is you were asked to say something, a set of words or
Right.
whatever, that are known by the system that's trying to recognize you.
Right.
And you would have already said those, and they do a direct match. Okay? So if somebody who's trying to defeat the system had a recording of you saying those things,
Right.
then they could do it. What you're saying is, if you just had a print of the person's voice,
Right.
and then you did a sort of a text-to-speech kind of thing, could be defeated? And the answer is probably yes.
Okay.
Yes. That falls under a slightly different umbrella. That's called, that might fall more under the voice conversion kinds of algorithms.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, we are doing some work in that area now. We've not tested it with the purpose of defeating such a system, because that's not such a noble goal. We probably would like to be on the other side of how you make it more secure, but you probably could do a fair job of defeating these systems. Yes, sir?
I'm just curious, what are the algorithms used in auto-tune? Is it similar algorithm for auto-tune? For auto-tune, the artist that's been using, are they similar algorithm that they're using?
So, I'm not sure, they may be using a phase vocoder,
Yeah.
which has many of the, and we've compared, I think they are, these results with phase vocoders, and the quality is a little bit higher.
Oh, phase vocoder higher or this one is higher?
Yeah, but there are many competing algorithms. This is the one that we just happened to use because we were fascinated with the elegance. Not to imply there's only one way to do this. Yeah.
So, okay, I'm just curious about this. So no articulatory features are being used.
No.
Articulatory features, like the vocal track, the position of the tongue.
Yes, that's correct.
So nothing of that stuff has been used. And if my understanding is right, no probabilistic model. I mean, to me it sounds like it's all about frequency domain. There's no Markov model, there's no probabilistic. It's very simple and elegant. Is it true?
Well, indirect, so we do use a little bit of a long-term history in the amplitude representation, but there's not a hidden Markov model or anything like that that's being used. Yes.
By looking into the time speaking transition, is it possible to alter the accent of the speaker?
So interesting that you mentioned that. We have done some work with accent detection. We had a project using the same model. We were approached by a Spanish teacher. She taught Spanish, and she was having trouble with U.S. students because of terrible pronunciation, and she wanted us to be able to automatically detect when a student had poor pronunciation of Spanish, then correct the person's voice and play it back to them. So we have looked at that. And the problem is not that challenging when you know what the words are and you can make the model for the proper accent. And so you can do the detection because there are features that stand out when Americans mispronounce a certain word, which we can identify because we know the word. We can identify that, and then we can use the same algorithm to adapt the frequencies, phases, and vocal track characteristics to model the ideas of speaking. And for that model, we use someone who's a native speaker of Spanish. So yes, we can do that, and we can do that.